Welcome to MATCH B2B INSIGHTS. I'm Benny Fluman, founder of MATCH B2B, and this show is really for Medtech CEOs and business development leaders who look up one day and realize we have good technology, we have some traction, so why does revenue still feel random?
And I'm Brian Newman. I work on the pipeline execution side of that problem. SDR architecture, outreach sequencing, buyer mapping, getting actual qualified conversations moving instead of just collecting names after an event and hoping something happens.
Yeah, and today's topic is one we see again and again. A company has a solid product, maybe a few early customers, maybe even some impressive logos. On the surface, it looks fine. The founders are busy, the sales deck is polished, conferences generate meetings. People say the market response is encouraging. But underneath that, there is no real commercial engine.
Right. It's momentum without a mechanism. That's the phrase I'd use. Because if you ask, where did the last 5 opportunities actually come from? The answer is usually some mix of conference traffic, a distributor intro, an old founder contact, a referral from an advisor. Useful? Sure. Repeatable? Not really.
Exactly, and that's the tension. What feels like growth is often just temporary access. It's not a system. It is a cluster of personal relationships and opportunistic moments. And the problem only becomes obvious when one of those channels slows down. Conference season ends, referrals get thinner, the CEO gets pulled into fundraising, product, regulatory, operations, and suddenly the pipeline looks much weaker than everyone thought.
And then people start trying to fix it tactically. Let's send more emails. Let's hire one salesperson. Let's do more LinkedIn. But if the commercial motion underneath is weak, more activity just creates more noise. You end up with a calendar that looks busy and a CRM that looks active, but very little moves stage to stage.
That's an important distinction. We are not talking about bad companies. Usually, these are strong companies. The product team is capable. The clinical logic may be strong. The market need may be real. The issue is not product existence. The issue is commercial structure. Is there a defined journey from awareness to conversation, to evaluation, to internal buyer alignment, to next step?
And can somebody other than the CEO make that happen consistently? Because if every meaningful deal still depends on the founder stepping in with credibility, connections, and persistence, then the company doesn't yet have a commercial system. It has founder-assisted selling.
Which is normal early on, by the way. I don't think founders should feel embarrassed by that. Early traction is often relationship-led. The mistake is assuming that because it worked at 10 customers, it will scale to 20, 30, 50. Usually, it won't.
Yeah, and especially in Medtech, people can confuse market interest with pipeline health. A booth was busy, the demo got good reactions. Somebody said circle back in Q3. That is not revenue movement. That's just interest signal. It matters, but it is not enough.
So that's where we're going today. How medtech companies move from random to repeatable. And why what used to pass for commercial momentum is now much less reliable than it was a few years ago. Let's push this into current context, because this is more dangerous in 2026 than it was before. Healthcare buyers are under heavier pressure now. Budget scrutiny is tighter. Implementation risk is discussed earlier. And operational friction matters much more than many vendors want to admit.
Yeah, a few years ago, some companies could get pretty far on innovation story alone. Here's a better device. Here's a smarter platform. Here's a breakthrough capability. Now the buyer hears that and immediately starts translating it into work. Who has to approve this? Who has to change process? What's the training burden? What's the cost of rollout if this goes sideways?
Exactly. The buying group is more cautious and more cross-functional. You are not just dealing with one champion who likes the technology. You are dealing with clinical stakeholders, operational stakeholders, procurement, sometimes finance, sometimes IT, depending on the solution. So if your message is still built mainly around product novelty, you are underserving the decision process.
And that creates a false read in early conversations. Teams say, the demo went well, fine. But did the demo answer the operational objections? Did it give the champion language they can reuse internally? Did it reduce perceived implementation complexity? If not, you're probably going to get a polite delay.
I keep coming back to one thing. Innovation is not the only risk the buyer sees. Sometimes it's not even the main one. The main risk is disruption. Will this interfere with workflow? Will staff resist it? Will the ROI take too long to prove? Will we spend internal political capital on something that does not scale inside the organization?
And when medtech companies keep selling the way they sold, let's say, even 2 or 3 years ago, they often lengthen their own cycle. They're leading with features, then more features, then another meeting to explain the features. Meanwhile, the buyer is still unclear on adoption path. So the opportunity doesn't die dramatically, it just drifts.
Death by let's revisit next quarter.
Exactly, and because the company still has some top-of-funnel activity, they don't immediately diagnose the real problem. They think the market is slow. Sometimes the market is slow, sure, but often the bigger issue is that the company is creating uncertainty inside the buyer process.
This is where the market has become unforgiving. Healthcare organizations are asking not only is this clinically interesting, but can we adopt this without creating extra drag? And can you help us justify this in a measurable way? If your commercial motion cannot answer those questions early, conversion weakens.
And the smaller the company, the more dangerous that is. Because you don't have endless runway to absorb 6-month delays caused by vague messaging and weak sequencing. You need fewer wasted conversations. You need clearer progression. You need a motion that earns attention and then guides it.
Right, so the issue is not simply that buying is harder. The issue is that old selling habits are now more expensive. They produce longer cycles, lower confidence, and weaker conversion at exactly the stage where small medtech companies can least afford it. So let's make that practical. What does the shift actually look like? For me, it's a move from an innovation story to an adoption story. Not because innovation stopped mattering. It absolutely matters. But novelty without implementation logic no longer creates enough urgency.
Yeah, buyers need to see the path, not just the promise. A lot of companies still present like this. Here's the technology, here's why it's unique, here's why it's better than legacy alternatives. And then they wonder why people nod in the meeting and disappear afterwards.
Because the buyer is silently asking 4 questions that are often not being answered. 1. Who actually adopts this inside the organization? 2. How does workflow change? 3. Where does friction appear in rollout? And 4. What does ROI look like in the first 6 to 12 months?
I'd add a 5th, maybe hidden question. How much effort am I personally taking on if I sponsor this? That's the political question. It's not always said out loud, but it's there. If your message increases that perceived effort, the deal slows down even if they like the product.
That's a good point. Feature-led messaging tends to increase buyer uncertainty because it keeps the conversation centered on what the product is. Adoption-led messaging reduces uncertainty because it shows how the product becomes usable, supportable, and justifiable in a real care environment.
So instead of saying, we have these 7 capabilities, you might say, here's where teams usually start, here's the workflow we do not ask you to change immediately, here's who needs to be involved early, and here's the operational metric customers care about first. That's a very different conversation.
And the stronger one, because now you're helping the buyer imagine safe adoption. In healthcare, that matters. Especially now, when implementation scrutiny is high and internal resources are stretched.
Also, adoption-led messaging makes follow-up easier. If I send a note after a first meeting and all I say is, great to show you the platform, attached is our deck, that's weak. But if I can recap, based on your environment, the likely first use case is X, the initial stakeholders are Y, and the main success metric in the first 2 quarters is Z, now the conversation has shape.
Yes, and shape creates momentum. This is why some companies with objectively good products still struggle commercially. They are over-explaining the solution and under-structuring the adoption path.
I mean, bluntly, buyers don't buy novelty. They buy believable progress. Novelty may open the door. Believable progress is what gets internal support.
That's well put. So if you're listening and thinking, we keep getting interest but not commitment, look at your story. Are you selling technology superiority? Or are you helping the buyer see implementation, workflow fit, and measurable value inside a realistic time frame?
Because if it's mostly the first one, the market is probably hearing interesting product. What you need them to hear is, this can actually work here. Let's talk symptoms, because most teams feel the problem before they can name it. The obvious one is post-conference follow-up that stalls. You come back with a stack of conversations, maybe some badge scans, a few promising meetings, and then 2 weeks later, almost nothing has progressed.
And internally, people say the event was good, but follow-up wasn't strong enough. Sometimes that's true. But if this happens repeatedly, it's usually more than sloppy execution. It often means the company has no clear conversion path after initial interest.
Another one, demos that don't convert. The team works hard to get the meeting happens, feedback sounds positive, then silence, delay, or endless, we're still discussing internally. Again, not always a product problem. Often it's that the demo answered curiosity, not commitment.
Then there is the CEO-dependent pipeline. This one is huge. If the strongest opportunities all require the CEO to open the door, carry the credibility, rescue the follow-up, and push next steps, that's not just a heroic founder story. That's a structural dependency.
Yeah, it means the market trusts the founder more than the commercial system. And that's a hard ceiling, because the CEO cannot be the SDR, account executive, evangelist, and implementation strategist forever. Well, they can for a while, but it's not fun.
And it distorts management perception. Because when the founder can still force some progress through personal effort, the organization underestimates how weak the underlying motion is.
I see one more signal a lot, activity without progression. There are emails going out, LinkedIn messages happening, webinars maybe, meetings on the calendar. But if you inspect the stages, nothing moves with consistency. That's usually structural, not tactical. Weak ICP focus, unclear sequencing, inconsistent follow-up, and message drift all combine to create the illusion of traction.
Exactly. Volume can hide design flaws. You can be very busy and commercially incoherent at the same time. If the ideal customer profile is too broad, your outreach will be diluted. If you haven't mapped the buying committee, you will speak to the wrong person too long. If your follow-up does not guide the next decision, you will create pleasant conversations that go nowhere.
And poor follow-up isn't just forgot to send an email. It's also sending the wrong kind of follow-up. Generic recap, deck attachment, just checking in. Those do not move a cautious healthcare buyer forward.
So when people ask, is this a market problem or an execution problem? My answer is often neither, exactly. It is an architecture problem. The company lacks a structured path from signal to qualified opportunity.
And once you frame it that way, the fix changes. You stop chasing random tactics and start asking better questions. Who are we really for? What triggers urgency? Which stakeholder needs what message? What should happen after a first conversation? That's where repeatability begins.
One reason we are speaking pretty directly about this is that MATCH B2B is currently in dialogue with multiple Medtech companies in the US. Those are live conversations, active commercial discussions, and they are sharpening our view of buyer expectations in real time.
Yeah, and what's interesting is the pattern is consistent even across different categories. The internal story inside the company is often, our value is obvious. But when you unpack what buyers are actually responding to, there is a gap, sometimes a big one.
The internal narrative tends to be capability heavy. Sophisticated technology, differentiated functionality, strong clinical rationale. All good. But buyers are filtering through a different lens. They want to understand adoption risk, workflow fit, and ROI justification much earlier than many teams expect.
And they don't always say it directly. That's the tricky part. A buyer may be polite, engaged, even enthusiastic. But if you're not hearing strong movement, it's often because they still don't know how this lands operationally. They're asking themselves, does this add friction to staff? Do we need cross-department coordination? Can we show a payoff in a time frame leadership will accept?
Exactly. Another thing we're hearing is that value narratives built for investors or industry visibility do not automatically convert in enterprise healthcare conversations. A company can sound impressive and still be commercially unclear.
That's a big one. The story that works on a stage or in a thought leadership piece isn't always the story that gets a director, operator, or buying group to take the next step. The market wants specificity. Where do we start? What's the lowest friction entry point? What changes first? What evidence matters?
And in these US conversations, the pressure around implementation is very tangible. Buyers are not just choosing between solutions, they are choosing between levels of disruption. If your message doesn't reduce perceived disruption, you are making the commercial job harder than it needs to be.
I also think buyer patience for vague ROI has dropped. Long-term transformation is not enough on its own. They want a credible near-term logic. Not fantasy numbers, not inflated savings claims, but a realistic line of sight to operational value.
That's important. Credible, not theatrical. A lot of commercial language in Medtech still overreaches, but the buyers we're seeing respond better when the company is disciplined, specific, and honest about how value accumulates.
So these live market signals are useful because they move us beyond theory. This isn't us guessing from a distance. We're hearing directly where companies are getting stuck and what buyers need to feel confident enough to progress.
And the message is quite clear. Strong innovation is still necessary, but it is not sufficient. The commercial winners will be the companies that translate innovation into adoptable, low-friction, financially understandable progress.
So if random effort isn't the answer, what does a repeatable system actually require? For me, it starts with clarity. Clear ICP first. Not hospitals as a category. That's not an ICP. You need to know what kind of organization, what context, what pain pattern, what maturity, what likely entry point.
Yes, if the target is vague, the message becomes vague, the outreach becomes vague, and the pipeline becomes noisy. After ICP, the next layer is buying committee mapping. Who can initiate? Who can block? Who cares about workflow? Who cares about budget logic? Who needs evidence in what form?
Then message discipline. That's a practical thing, not a branding slogan. It means your outreach, your first call, your deck, your follow-up, your LinkedIn posts, even webinar themes, all reinforce the same commercial logic. Not one story for marketing, another for sales, another for the CEO in investor mode.
And then, stage-based customer journey design. This is where smaller companies often get relief. They think scale requires a big team. It doesn't necessarily. What it requires is a defined journey. What should a prospect understand after first contact? What should happen after a discovery conversation? What evidence is needed before a pilot discussion? What internal concerns need to be addressed before procurement friction appears?
Exactly. When that's designed well, a small medtech team can cover hospitals, clinics, and distributors far more efficiently. Not by doing more random outreach, but by using a tailored sequence for each route to market. Different stakeholders, different objections, different pacing, but one coherent architecture underneath.
And this is the part I want to stress. Repeatability is not hustle. It is not everyone work harder after the conference. Repeatability comes from commercial architecture. It comes from deciding how demand is created, how trust is built, how qualification happens, how handoffs work, and how next steps are defined.
You also need operational discipline. Simple KPIs, but meaningful ones, not vanity metrics. I don't care if you send 800 emails if none reach the right stakeholders with the right message. I care whether conversations progressed with accounts that fit the ICP and whether follow-up created movement.
That's where strategy and execution have to meet. Because a good system is not abstract. It should reduce commercial drag. It should make forecasting less emotional. And it should allow the business to grow without adding headcount every time you want more pipeline.
And that's especially important for companies in the 10 to 50 person range. Resources are tight. You don't want operational drag. You want a lean motion that can be refined, measured, and improved. That's how you go from occasional wins to a pipeline you can actually work with.
Let's talk content, because this gets misunderstood a lot. Thought leadership is not valuable because it makes you look active. It is valuable if it creates trust with a precise buyer and moves that buyer toward a structured next step.
Yeah, visibility alone is a weak outcome. I mean, it's nice. But if the content does not help a target buyer say, these people understand the problem I'm actually dealing with, then it's just market noise.
And in MedTech, the strongest content is usually problem-based, not self-celebratory. Start from the commercial reality the buyer is living. Post-conference follow-up that goes nowhere. Innovation interest without adoption clarity. Internal resistance because workflow impact is vague. Those are conversation starters.
Then add evidence and business outcome framing. Not just our platform is advanced, but here's where commercial friction typically appears, here's how smart teams reduce it, here's what buyers want to understand before they move. That kind of content earns a different level of attention.
Exactly, because now the company is acting like a credible guide, not just a vendor asking for a meeting. And from there, content has to connect into a conversion path. LinkedIn, webinars, outreach, and follow-up should not be disconnected tactics.
Right. If someone engages with a post, attends a webinar, downloads something, or replies to outreach, the next step should feel natural, not book a demo immediately. Maybe it's a focused discussion around a specific commercial problem. Maybe it's a short diagnostic, but there has to be a bridge.
This is why content strategy and pipeline strategy cannot live in separate rooms. If marketing is publishing broad thought leadership and sales is sending generic outbound, you break the buyer experience. Trust is created in one place and then wasted in another.
And consistency matters. One good webinar won't fix weak architecture. But if your messaging is disciplined, content can pre-educate the market. It can warm up the exact objections that otherwise slow down calls. It can make outreach feel familiar rather than intrusive.
I sometimes say content should do 3 jobs: sharpen positioning, reduce buyer uncertainty, and create entry into a real conversation. If it's not doing at least 2 of those, it's probably not helping enough.
That's good. And the outreach side gets easier when content is aligned. SDR or founder follow-up can reference a clear commercial point the market has already seen. That makes the conversation less about, can we get 30 minutes, and more about, you mentioned this problem. Are you seeing the same thing internally? Much stronger.
So the goal is not content for content's sake. The goal is one integrated path, from message to trust to conversation to opportunity. That's when thought leadership starts behaving like revenue infrastructure instead of marketing activity. Maybe this is a good place to explain why Brian and I approach this together. Because the split matters. My role is usually to diagnose the growth constraint. Where is the commercial model misaligned? Is the value proposition aimed at the wrong maturity level? Is demand generation disconnected from sales reality? Is pricing logic, message logic, and buyer expectation misaligned?
And my side is translating that into motion. Okay, if the ICP is this, who are the actual people inside the account? What sequence do we use? What message lands first? What does follow-up look like? How do we turn a strategy deck into meetings with the right stakeholders and real pipeline progression?
Exactly, because many companies are not missing effort. They are missing alignment. They may have content, outreach, founder involvement, even some inbound, but the pieces don't reinforce each other. The result is scattered activity.
And scattered activity usually creates random wins, which can be misleading. You close one deal and think, great, let's just do more of that. But if you can't explain why it worked and repeat it outside the founder's network, you're not building a system.
This is where the strategic and operational combination matters. Strategy without execution stays theoretical. Execution without strategy becomes busy work. What companies need is a commercial architecture that is then made executable in the market.
Yeah, and honestly, the operational piece has to be grounded in reality. Small medtech teams can't afford bloated sales structures. They need lean systems, tight messaging, good research, clear prioritization, smart follow-up, relentless iteration. That's how you create qualified conversations in weeks, not months of internal debate.
And the diagnosis has to be honest. Sometimes the issue is not outreach volume. Sometimes the issue is that the company is talking about itself in a way the buyer cannot use. Sometimes the route to market is muddled. Sometimes the customer journey has gaps. Unless you identify the true bottleneck, you will optimize the wrong thing.
I think that's why these engagements work best when founders are willing to hear, you don't have a lead problem, you have a progression problem. Or you don't have a messaging problem alone, you have a sequencing problem. It's not always the headline issue they expected.
Yes, but once the issue is named correctly, progress becomes much more practical. You can rebuild the journey, tighten the narrative, define the stages, and create a measurable pipeline motion. That's the move from scattered effort to predictable commercial behavior.
And that's really what this whole conversation is about. Not more noise, more structure that actually produces measurable pipeline.
So, let's close this in a practical way. If parts of this episode felt uncomfortably familiar, the first step is not a giant transformation project. Usually, it's a diagnostic conversation. Brian, when someone speaks with you first, what should they expect?
A practical conversation, basically. We're looking at where the pipeline is breaking today. Is the real problem ICP definition? Is it messaging that creates interest but not urgency? Is it sequencing? Is follow-up too weak? Is the CEO carrying too much of the commercial load? I'm trying to identify the actual source of friction, not just the symptom that hurts the most.
And that's important because companies often come in saying, we need more leads, when the deeper issue is conversion design.
Exactly. So the conversation usually gets pretty concrete. What does your pipeline currently depend on? What happens after conferences? What happens after demos? Which stakeholders are you speaking to? What are they responding to? Where are deals stalling? Once we see that, we can outline an initial process, what to tighten first, what to stop doing, and what realistic next steps might look like.
And expectation setting matters too, not fantasy promises, realistic ROI logic. If the company changes its commercial architecture, what kind of improvement is plausible? Over what timeline? Under what level of internal commitment?
Yeah, I never want these conversations to feel vague or oversold. Sometimes the answer is you need clearer messaging and better follow-up. Sometimes it's broader, ICP, journey, outreach structure, content alignment, but the goal is clarity. What is broken? What would a fix involve? And what outcomes are realistic from there?
So, if you are a Medtech CEO or business development leader in that 10 to 50 person range, and you are seeing the signals we discussed, post-conference follow-up stalling, demos not converting, CEO-dependent pipeline, lots of activity but little progression, it may be worth having that conversation.
You can reach me directly at brian.newman@match-b2b.com or by phone at +972 549 990 168. And WhatsApp is absolutely welcome. If the situation feels familiar, send a note, give me a call, and we can talk through the pipeline gaps, what a process could look like, and what kind of ROI is actually realistic.
That's the right tone for it. Helpful, direct, no theater. And really, that's the spirit of this podcast. We are not here to admire the problem. We are here to name it clearly and move toward a better commercial system.
Yeah, if this episode got you asking some hard questions internally, good. That's probably useful.
Brian, thanks. Good conversation.
Thanks, Benny. Appreciate it.
And to everyone listening, we'll keep going deeper on the structural issues behind Medtech growth. See you next time.
Bye, everyone.